This episode is brought to you by SS&C Mineralware. Are you managing mineral assets and feeling overwhelmed? Unsure if you're getting paid what you're owed? SS&C Mineralware is here to simplify the management of your minerals, royalties, and non-operated working interests. Mineralware's out-of-the-box features give you the tools you need to visualize and keep track of all of your assets in one place. Mineralware lets you know in seconds where your interests are, what's active, what acreage is open for lease, and if you're getting paid what you're owed. With Mineralware, you can even automate your revenue and JIB processing and eliminate tedious manual data entry, allowing you to focus on more pressing issues. Thousands of mineral owners rely on Mineralware to keep their mineral management simple, automatic, and all in one place. Take control of your mineral assets today with SS&C Mineralware. To see a demo, you can visit their website at www.mineralware.com. That's mineralware.com.
Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. In this episode, we're going to cover the latest oil and gas and mineral rights news for April of 2026. And Justin, I'm sure the big question on everybody's mind is what is the impact on oil prices going to be from the Iran war? And so we're going to do a little bit of more of a focus on that because I know that's certainly a lot of the questions I've been getting are focused on that. And I have a question in my mind too is, when are we going to see prices come back down, or if ever? And so we'll dive into that, but then have some other stories as well.
Yeah, no lack of news right now. And with the higher oil prices and gas prices, I think the question becomes, is this really going to be temporary? Which is what I think we're hearing on mainstream media is this is going to be a temporary setback. And, once this is over, things will really resume. But the reality might be just a bit different, Matt, because there's some infrastructure and some supply that's been taken off the market. And, maybe the real boost is coming from the unknown of what's going to happen supply-wise whenever this is over.
Yeah, that's a great point. Things I think were maybe temporary in nature up until that attack. And so you want to dive into that first story and let's talk about that.
Let's do it. So the article here from the New York Times says, as the war with Iran began to send oil and gas prices around the world, President Trump shrugged it off as a temporary setback for the U.S. economy. And Matt, that tone's kind of carried throughout the conflict. This article goes on to say that even if Trump were to broker an end to hostilities with Iran before his deadline, it may still be weeks, if not months, before we really see a true break in energy cost. And this is kind of coming from economists and energy industry executives that are talking about the infrastructure that really has been taken out on this. There's a quote, it says, from Mark Zandi, the chief economist for Moody Analytics, said the prospect of sustained high cost affirmed a well-worn adage in the energy industry: price rises like a rocket and falls like a feather. And so, Matt, if the war were to end soon, he predicted that it would still take about 6 to 8 weeks for oil production and shipments to normalize. And at that point, oil could settle around 80 per barrel of Brent crude, higher than before we started this war with Iran. Prices at the pump would probably fall slowly too. And that makes a lot of sense, Matt. You want to talk a bit about, the infrastructure that's been taken offline, and this may have more of an impact than just closing the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And we'll dive into that. We have another article that talks about the specific attacks and the facilities that were damaged. But really up until last week, we had the concept that the oil that was taken off the market was temporary in nature. It was around 20% of global oil production was being blocked, and a lot of the countries were shutting in production. And if you shut in production, you're basically closing valves, and it's a temporary disruption that you can turn back those wells, when you have some place for that oil to go. But after those attacks, it damaged those facilities. And so there's going to have to be repairs made before some of those facilities are able to be brought back online. And that could take years. So that's the big question. And I think the gist of this article, this first article really says that, we're looking at prices are going to be elevated for a while. Like that adage said, they're going to come down slowly, but they will come down once supply is resumed. And so it really all hinges on if the U.S. and Iran can broker a deal and we can have a ceasefire. And I think that would be in everybody's best interest. And so I think, ultimately, when they attacked the Iranian energy facilities, Iran retaliated, and we'll dive into the specifics of that retaliation and what that means for oil prices and global capacity here in a second. But ultimately, I think a really good quote here is from Mike Wirth, who's the CEO of Chevron. He said, quote, "How quickly that production can actually come back online is an uncertainty that we're going to have to deal with as we go forward." So I expect that we'll see elevated prices for a lot longer than maybe was originally expected because of those attacks. And so we'll talk about that here in a second. But before that, in response to this supply disruption, the International Energy Agency have agreed to release 400 million barrels from strategic oil reserves. And in this article here, it talks about what countries have strategic oil reserves and how much. Do you want to give us an overview, Justin?
Yeah, man, I thought it was really interesting. And I was surprised that Japan is one of the largest holders. So, Matt, we did a show about the strategic reserve and kind of the history of it in the United States, which will be episode 326. And we highlighted the fact that the U.S. Department of Energy said they'll release 172 million barrels. And that was in response to trying to lower energy costs with the Iran war. And others are also starting to look at releasing it. As Matt, like you mentioned, the IEA is looking to release the barrels. Japan has also said that they're going to release, I believe it was about 80 million barrels of oil. Japan, at the end of 2025, the country held about 470 million barrels in emergency reserves, which is enough to meet 254 days of domestic consumption. So, microeconomically in Japan, they could really offset the price of oil if they choose. And then the UK as well. The UK holds about 38 million barrels of crude oil and 30 million barrels of refined products as strategic reserves, which, Matt, that's shockingly small, in my opinion. And then the EU member nations, including Germany, France, Spain, and Italy, also hold strategic oil reserves that kind of vary in size. But there is some ability, and it's interesting that they're looking at this right now to try to ease the price. And I think, Matt, the problem currently is the unknown of really nobody knows what's going to happen. It depends on what ends up happening with Iran and then what the recovery period is like for them to get infrastructure back online.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so you have these countries that are very dependent on exports that have a strategic oil reserve just to buffer the impact of a supply disruption. And Japan, in particular, is one country that's most dependent on imports. And so they have, again, that 470 million barrels in emergency reserves, which I think is one of the largest relative to their daily consumption, which is enough to meet 254 days, which is a long time. So, they've already started tapping into those reserves. And then China as well, which in 2025, China had bought more than 80% of Iran's oil. And so that means that they were very dependent on Iran exports. And like you said, Justin, who knows how many barrels? They're not going to publicly release that information, but some of the energy analytics firms, Vortexa here it mentions that they suggested that they have over 1.13 billion barrels of oil in storage in 2025, and that's excluding underground storage. And so I imagine they could probably tell that through satellite imagery of tanks and the level of the oil in the tanks based on the height of the roof in the tank. You can tell how much oil's in it. But so they probably have a lot more than that, 1.13 billion. But ultimately, the countries that have strategic oil reserves, and certainly with excess capacity like the U.S. is probably the biggest example of that, because we basically produce enough to meet our domestic needs for the most part. So this release of oil is really more a temporary impact on prices. And so we talked about that in detail, again, like Justin mentioned in episode 326. So definitely listen to that. It talks about all the nuances around strategic petroleum reserves. But I thought it was interesting, this breakdown of all these countries like Japan, the UK, and the EU that also have strategic oil reserves. And I think countries that don't have those strategic reserves are going to feel the hurt very quickly here.
Yeah, including the UK, which I'm sure they're heavily impacted and looking at what they can do. And Matt, to kind of dive into part of the reason that this is happening. So 23 oil and gas sites targeted since the beginning of the Iran conflict, this ABC article says. Since the United States and Israel attacked Iran 3 weeks ago, at least 23 oil and natural gas facilities across 9 countries in the Middle East have been hit by military strikes from Iranian, Israel, and U.S. forces, according to this ABC News article. So, Matt, that's a huge hit on infrastructure. I mean, that's going to make no small impact. That's not something that's going to come back just overnight. The 2 most consequential attacks on energy sites, according to experts, occurred last week with Israel's attack on South Pars gas field in Iran, and Iran strikes on the Ras Laffan industrial city in Qatar, which is the world's largest natural gas processing facility. In a statement, state-owned Qatar Energy said Iranian missile attack damaged the 2 LNG trains and is expected to decrease their export capacity by 17% and result in an annual revenue loss of about $20 billion. So, Matt, that's a pretty large impact. And we've been talking about the number of 20% of closing the Strait of Hormuz, but this is a 70% impact in a different part of the infrastructure here.
Yeah, and this is a very targeted and specific attack in retaliation for Israel's attack on the South Pars gas field in Iran. And ironically, both of those facilities produce from the same formation, just on the different side of the border there. And so very interesting. If you do a deep dive, and Doomberg actually released an article on this. And if you are not a subscriber of Doomberg and you really want to stay in tune and in touch with what's going on in energy and heavy industry, highly recommend subscribing to their Substack. It's really good. And so anyway, they did a deep dive on this, and it turns out, so Iran warned of the attack, and there are 14 trains in that Ras Laffan industrial city that produce liquefied natural gas, or LNG. The ones that they hit were trains 4 and 6, which took offline 12.8 million tons per annum of production, which is about 17% of Qatar's exports, like they mentioned in that statement. And there's a mix of ownership on all these different trains. Some of them are wholly owned by Qatar, or Qatar, I think is how you actually pronounce it. And then the others are a mix of joint ventures with foreign partners, including American, French, Korean, and Japanese interests. The ones that they hit were those that there was a JV between Qatar Energy and ExxonMobil, a U.S. company. So they very purposefully, I think, attacked the U.S. facilities. The rest of those were left unscathed. Nothing happened to them. So the ones that they hit were those that ExxonMobil had an interest in, which I'm sure was no coincidence. So ultimately, before those attacks and those 23 different facilities, it's a mix of oil and gas facilities. We've seen, obviously, the impact on oil prices because of this war. In the U.S., we haven't seen really an impact on gas prices. We were hitting, before we hit record, I should say, natural gas prices. The price at the pump has gone up by about $1 per gallon. But natural gas prices spiked initially after that first strikes, and then it's come back down to where the prices were before the war started, hovering around $3 per MCF. And so, you may be wondering, why hasn't gas responded like that? And well, it's because the price that we see here, the Henry Hub spot price, and even the futures prices, are based on the supply of natural gas in the United States, which we are still in an oversupply situation. So despite those supply disruptions in the Middle East, all that means is the spread between the LNG price, that we can sell that gas for in Asia or Europe, that has gone up because there's more demand and some of that supply is taken offline. And so the U.S. is going to fill in the gaps for some of that. And so that means those companies that own LNG facilities in the U.S. are probably going to make a little bit more money on those volumes of LNG that they're selling in Europe and Asia, because those prices internationally have gone up, even though the United States, we haven't seen as much of a impact there. But, I think that the moral of this story is that prior to this attack, or these attacks, the thought, as we alluded to in that first article, was that the impact on oil prices from this conflict would be constrained to a few months. Things would resume slowly to normal once the Strait of Hormuz reopened. Once those facilities were taken offline, that basically was totally taken off the table. So I think ultimately what we can expect to see is higher oil prices for longer. And I think there was a quote in here that's really interesting. Every day that the conflict continues, basically, we need, quote, at least a week, probably 2 weeks on the other side to make it up, said Philip Jones Lux, a senior analyst at Swiss-based market intelligence company Sparta Commodities. quote, we are not getting back to the oil price we had before this conflict anytime this year, and probably also not by mid 2027 either. So, maybe looking at a couple of years now before we start to see prices go back to where they were prior to this conflict. So I think that's probably the biggest question that was on my mind, Justin, is, okay, this thing happened. There's a temporary supply disruption. When are prices going to fall back down? Are we going to see this being the new normal for a while? And it sounds like that might actually be the case, at least for the next year and a half or so, as these facilities are basically permanently damaged in many cases.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a slow, increase. And I think there's the unknown, which can make the quick fluctuations. But as supply and demand takes back over, it'll be interesting to see if those prices stay sustained, which, again, Matt, sounds like with the damage that's happened to infrastructure, that's probably going to be a pretty likely scenario.
Yeah, and it was interesting because we were looking at the price of oil before we hit record, and it was actually down about 2% today to about $90 a barrel, West Texas Intermediate. And I will say that I don't think prices are going to go back down, like this article says, to the $60 it was before the conflict. But it will probably go down a little bit from where it's at now. If the Strait of Hormuz, if there's a ceasefire, if the Strait of Hormuz reopens, maybe we'll see prices drop down to $80 a barrel, $75 a barrel. And I think that's what they're referring to, is that those are the higher prices that we'll probably see for, the next year or more, just as the capacity that was damaged was taken offline. So I think it will fall from where it is now. Definitely not until, not down to $60 once things resolve, which hopefully they will soon.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And when there's the other things that can impact the price of the pump too. We were talking about before we hit record that there was a refinery fire at the Valero refinery in Port Arthur, which that can certainly make a spread between, the price you're paying at the pump if they can't refine that product and get it out to market versus the actual price of oil.
Yeah, great point.
All right, Matt. So our next one here is Colorado specific. So kind of set some context. There was a 2-year ceasefire between the oil and gas industry and violent menace, which appears to be coming to an end as the two sides return to the battlefield in Colorado. In 2024, a fragile truce was negotiated by Governor Jared Polis. Industry supporters and environmental groups vowed not to introduce additional competing ballot measures designed to boost or regulate oil and gas operations. And Matt, this could kind of be a expensive and high-stakes showdown, which most likely isn't going to shake out to be the best for Colorado's oil and gas industry. So right now, there's a conservative political group, Advance Colorado, who wants to amend the Constitution to secure the right for producers to sell and customers to use natural gas for cooking or heating. And then on the opposing side, they want to phase out natural gas heating and replace it with electric appliances. So, Matt, this is an effort to reduce carbon pollution, and this has kind of been the two camps that we've seen. And there's not a whole lot of logical middle ground, but these seem to be kind of on extreme ends here.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. There's the thought that, well, you need to use a certain type of energy, the government dictating what's right or what's wrong for people. I think I have a fundamental problem with that. And it's probably no surprise to people that I'm libertarian leaning. And so I generally think the government should stay out of attempts to tell people what to do with their lives. And so I think when it comes to energy, that certainly is the case. And so if somebody wants to put in a natural gas range, they should have every right to, and not be blocked by a local government or state government, saying, no, you can't do that because of an arbitrary policy around the type of energy that we should use for whatever reason. So ultimately, saying, well, no, you have to have the ability for someone to use it. I guess I can see the point of the ballot initiative is by getting it on the ballot. If people agree to it, then it sort of locks in the right for people to use natural gas appliances, because there have been quite a few pushes, at least at the local level, maybe county building code level, to block the ability to install a natural gas line to a new townhome or a house that's being built. And so, you really are limited at that point if you don't even have a gas line running to your house as to the type of energy that you want to use. So you're probably just going to get an electric stove or a heat pump. The thing that's very interesting about all of this, I think, just an anecdotal note about forcing people to use one type of energy or another, and particularly with trying to reduce carbon emissions and forcing people to use electric, whether that's electric cars or electric appliances. What that means is, like in Colorado, we need heat in the wintertime. And so right now, most of the heaters, you have either a forced air heater or a boiler or something like that. It's natural gas fired here. That's the primary carbon based fuel that we use. in parts of the East Coast, they have heating oil and things like that. But in any case, that's pretty efficient, and it takes the demand off of the grid by using those forms of energy, and it's clean burning, all those things. If you force people to say, okay, you have to drive an electric car and you have to have a heat pump to heat your house, well, heat pumps are not efficient in the winter when it's very cold out. And electric cars, they require a lot of electricity to recharge. I think they're great from a local, running errands and fuel economy standpoint. But if you put all that pressure on the grid, you're going to start to overtax it, and then that's going to cause downstream issues around brownouts and blackouts. And we've seen that where we've gone away from using natural gas, let's say for power generation, and put in more wind and solar, which is good when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. But if they're not, then that means that capacity is offline. And if you don't have something to back it up, like a natural gas or a nuclear plant, then that means you have to shut off some of the electricity to those users, and that's a rolling blackout or something like that. So all these things, I think it's these political games that are being played by both sides to both try to lock in the ability to use natural gas, which I'm fine with, having the right to do whatever you want. I don't think they should mandate that you need to use it either. Obviously, it should be your free choice as to what you want to put in your house. But ultimately, what this is going to do is potentially open the floodgates to competing measures to block the industry and cause more headaches and heartburn for oil producers and for mineral owners in Colorado in particular. If they have some initiative that comes in that blocks or puts some constraint on emissions or something that causes companies to have to curtail oil or gas production, that's going to hurt mineral and royalty owners in Colorado.
Again, the two sides are just not really having productive conversation. It seems to be they're really far to either side, and that makes for kind of warfare rather than coming to solutions here, man. Last but not least, the rig count, which overall week over week we're down 1 unit, so not a ton of change. It looks like they're moving around some assets, but not a whole lot going on. Down 2 in Colorado, looks like down 2 in Utah, down 2 in Wyoming. It looks like we gained a couple in Oklahoma, New Mexico, North Dakota. Looks like about it. So just kind of moving things around.
Yeah, just shuffling the pieces on the board. And, it's interesting. We think about the rig count, and the other question, logical question is if we expect to see oil prices higher for longer, when are we going to start seeing an increase in drilling? And I think the answer to that, especially for the public companies, they sort of look on quarterly budget cycles and planning cycles. So they've already set their capital budgets for this year, but a lot of these companies already are talking about, from my understanding, having a lot of extra free cash flow that they're going to have to reinvest. So if prices stay above $75 a barrel, $80 a barrel, I expect that maybe this quarter, we're kind of in that time period, the end of the first quarter and starting in the second quarter, depending on the companies where they are in that planning cycle, they may start to look at how do we spend some additional money, thinking that this is going to last for a little bit longer. Certainly by this summer, they'll have plans in place. I think if we see prices still where they're at, that they'll be adding rigs and drilling more wells. So I do think that we are going to see a positive impact on drilling activity in the U.S. because of the higher prices, which it sounds like now, again, we're looking at maybe somewhat elevated prices for at least a year or two. And I think that's that stability that companies need. It needs to be stable, and it needs to be high enough, for long enough that they can say, okay, we can start to plan on this. If we're seeing oil still hovering, above $75, we think this is, all the analysis that suggests it's going to be the case, at least through this year. Then they can start to plan, once they have cash in hand as well. I think that's why we're seeing this lagging thing. I'd say this summer is once you have a quarter of excess cash flow, you got to do something with that money. You got to either buy back stock, pay a dividend, or drill more wells. And they'll probably do a little bit of all three of those, at least for the public companies. The private companies don't have the constraint of having to buy back stock or pay extra dividends per se. They're probably going to look at reinvesting that money and drilling more wells. So keep an eye on that, in your area with your operator. I would again say by this summer, you should start to hear if we're seeing prices where they're at, see activity start to pick up.
It'll be interesting to see, Matt. We've been talking about drilled uncompleted wells for a couple years now as well. So we'll see if that inventory starts to be tapped. I would imagine that'd be the first place they look.
Yeah, that's a great catch as well. I think you're absolutely right. So All right. Well, that wraps up this month's news episode. Certainly no lack of news and none of it positive, really, unfortunately. And I guess unless you're thinking of it from an oil price perspective and a royalty owner, obviously, look at the bigger picture, though. And, again, my hearts go out to those affected by this war. And hopefully we can get this handled quickly and back to normal, so to speak, whatever that means. So anyway, thanks again for listening. And thanks again, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.